Okay, I think we can get started. It's 2 p.m. in the UK and it is 6 a.m. in UC Irvine, I think. So we're particularly appreciative of our speaker today getting up particularly early, and of course, always appreciative of everyone coming. My name is David Mills, and I'm chairing today's webinar. This is the third in our series on universities under fire. And a couple of weeks ago, we had from John Douglas talking about his insights into what's happening. And so now we're welcoming James Smith, who is Professor of Global Studies in Law, Anthropology and Criminology at UC Irvine, and has been thinking a lot in an interdisciplinary way about human rights and legal cultures, and has written about Channel Tunnel, of all things, which is interesting for us in the UK, bridging divide, Channel Tunnel, English legal identity, which we've all been worrying about ever since Brexit, and also I'm still worrying about it. Coming up next week is a whole session on a book on Brexit and how that's impacted higher education in the UK. So it's a great honour to have you here, Eve, and thank you so much for getting up early. The screen is yours. You're going to talk for about half an hour or so, and then there'll be time for everyone to ask questions. As always, we'll record this and we'll post it tomorrow along with the slides. So and I'm going to be in charge of the slides, so you might just occasionally nod at me or say David and pass it on. Great, Eve, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, David, for inviting me to be part of this. I wish I was with you in person and everyone in the room, but thanks for everyone on the Zoom as well, or Teams. It is 6 o'clock in the morning here in California. It's pitch black outside, which seems really strange, but the sun will probably shine in the room behind me as we talk over the next little while. So it's wonderful to be here. I thank you very much for that warm introduction, David. I'm sort of going to talk to you a little bit from the perspective of both a chair of a Department of Global Studies, and so my position is very much informed by how it's actually impacting the classroom and teaching environment within the University of California on my campus and the wider campus, 10-campus system. But also last week, I was just in DC. I'm a fellow at the AAUP Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom. And so that was a very important meeting for me, coming together, lots of people, experts in the field of higher education in the US. And the ultimate message was not particularly bright. So I'll get to that, but that's sort of where I'm coming from a policy DC perspective, as well as a very localized, grounded perspective in the classroom. Next slide, please, David.
Okay, it's gone forward for us anyway. We can see it.
Do you want me to try and move it forward?
No, where everyone else can see, we're on slide 2. I think you might be looking at your own slides. You might want to unshare your, I'm not sure whether you can see. You should be able to see.
Does it change for you?
Yeah. Yes, yeah, it has. No, every time you say it's changed. We're on slide 2 now.
Okay, so this is the book I wrote. It just came out actually in May of this year, called Policing Higher Education. And this book was very much informed by what I was seeing in the US over the last 2, 3, 4 years, in which certain Republican states, such as Florida and Georgia and Texas and so on, were very, very aggressively censoring higher education. So there I am in California. Most people in California weren't really impacted. So the country itself of the United States has been for the last 3 or 4 years very differently governed in terms of censorship and policing higher education. And in this book, I was very interested. This is a picture of Governor DeSantis, and as you probably have heard from your other speakers, the Stop the Woke Act, very big attack on critical race theory and so on. And of course, many educational gag orders were put into place. And you can see there the red states primarily, where there was a great deal of censorship around the syllabus, around what you could say in the classroom on colleges and university campuses. So this was sort of the driving impetus for writing my book. But of course, book bans, this is just a picture from book bans, many books banned, and this will give you a graph which shows you how many book bans were attempted to be made since 2020. So this is, again, very much under the Republican push in the states of Texas, Georgia, and so on, pushing this extraordinary censorship of what can be taught and how libraries can hold books and so on. So this was sort of the concern of my book, but I was very anxious because these conversations were very domestic, very much within the US context. And I was anxious to put the conversation of censorship of higher education and political interference into college campus life within a global context. So my book is very much about the US in a global context and very much informed by the group called Scholars at Risk and other NGOs and big organizations that have been tracking the decline of academic freedom, primarily in countries that we do not associate with the Euro-American Academy, mostly global South countries, but of course they have been very anxiously showing how much the United States is joining many other countries that have a very bad record of censorship of higher education. So the book's, you know, as I say, about the US, but in global context, very much aware of the growing cadre of far-right leaders and authoritarian governments around the world. So increasingly putting the United States in this context of authoritarian leaders. And I was anxious to point out, as many are now talking about, that this was really before it became sort of an acceptable conversation in the United States, that fascism was emerging in the US. I don't know if people know the work of Alberto Toscano, but he writes in his book called Late Fascism about how fascism has emerged in its current resonance across Europe, across the United States, across Africa, across Latin America, and so on. So it's a very interesting philosophical political theory book, but it shows that we don't have to think of fascism only in the sense of the ideology of Italian German fascism, that we need to think about the material and political conditions of fascism in a much more expansive way that allows us to see the conditions of fascism before the 1920s in many places around the world, and certainly allows us to talk about late fascism in the 21st century. So this is the bigger context in which the book is situated. And on all these, you know, far-right leaders that are rising in numbers around the world, you have an authoritarian checklist. And I think this is important to note because higher education is only one of the controlling levers of authoritarian governments. So you can see they're controlling the bureaucracy, the military, the legal system, the media, elections, civil society, and so on. Controlling higher education is part of this toolkit. And I think it's very important for us in the US, but also in other countries where you may not see the censorship so aggressively of higher education, but you may see censorship of the media or controlling elections or of the judiciary. And they should all be indicators that this is a part of a suite of mechanisms whereby far-right leaders are really trying to take control of their citizenry. Of course, we know about the worldwide student protests around the invasion of Gaza, and that's when things really started to heat up in the United States, which hadn't really, as a sort of, in a general sense, been aware of what was going on around the world. This is a picture from my own campus, UC Irvine, in May 2024. We had 300 riot police called onto campus. It was a very distressing day. 47 people were arrested. And the campus has never been the same since, frankly, because the chancellor called in saying that there was an emergency, that there was potential violence on campus, justifying this extraordinary display of external police on campus. And of course, there was no justification for it at all. So these are just some of the images. Actually, I've been teaching in this hall behind where the students were protesting to give you a sense of the very visceral, very grounded distress by people that continues to this day on our college campus. And then, of course, within the United States, and I know that you listened to a wonderful lecture by John Douglas a couple of weeks ago, where he actually laid out many other things that Trump has now done. But under the second administration, this is just some imagery that will help you to remember what are some of the things that he talked about. But you have, under his executive orders, you have words being disappeared not just within college and university classrooms, but across research agendas and across the civil service. Things such as climate emergency, social justice, gender-based violence, gender identity, climate science, and so on. So you can just see some of the words that have been disappeared in an incredibly Orwellian moment, frankly, that is tying us up in knots in terms of how to teach. Most of the faculty in my department teach around gender and race and global politics of inequality. And so we just started our first week of class last week, and they are tied up in knots thinking how they're going to teach in the classroom. So we can talk about that a little bit in Q&A about how it impacts people on the ground. And of course, you know, these executive orders under the second Trump administration, DEI offices have been basically dissolved, dismantled. Science, as we know, has been dramatically underfunded. Many grants have been canceled and removed. And, you know, students are being disappeared off campus. So this is not something that has happened on a wide scale, but it has happened sufficiently for everyone to come to campus thinking that they may have to lock their classroom down if ICE occurs on their campus. So it has happened to a few students, as we know, but it's the threat, it's the chilling threat of ICE on campus that has really put everyone in a great deal of distress and anxiety. And so just within the classroom, there has certainly been an extreme chilling effect on how people talk amongst themselves, talk with their students. I'm teaching this quarter a couple of classes, but once to 100 students on global environmental politics. And when the President of the United States says in the United Nations talk that we all saw, that the climate emergency is a con job, it is a very difficult conversation to have. Everyone's very scared that they're going to be filmed on students' phones and reported. So that's the big threat, that we're actually going to be reported. And some of you may have seen at Texas A&M, a lecturer was actually forced to resign because she tried to defend the notion of gender identity, and a student videotaped the teacher, and the chair of the department was also forced to step down. So this is not something that's remote at all, this chilling effect and self-censorship. So today's educational crisis threatens people's right to pursue knowledge, think critically, challenge the status quo, and there's many different levers or mechanisms, drivers of this: book bans, as I said, defunding research, arresting students and faculty without due process, and so on. That is the current state of play, at least in my university, and I think many, many other universities now across the entire country, not just in Republican-led states, as had been the case over the last couple of years. And clearly, the Trump administration, which we talk about the Trump administration, but it's really Donald Trump is the executive administration, and everyone is obeying his orders, understands how knowledge is power. Tax on Columbia, tax on Harvard, some of these very, very elite universities, which are highly symbolic, as we know, but of course do not represent the majority of colleges and universities across the country. But there is also a sense that all college campuses, even if they're not rich and powerful, will be attacked. And so what we're seeing now is the dismantling of the Department of Education aggressively in the last couple of months. We're seeing Donald Trump attacking UCLA, which is one of the 10 campuses in my University of California system, claiming that the campus owes $1 billion in fines to him. Governor Newsom, the governor of California, is fighting back, saying he will sue the Trump administration. So it's a very, very volatile environment, even in California, which is very, very progressive compared to other US states. And I don't know whether this was actually mentioned in John Douglas's lecture, but we have also a great sense of people wanting to leave the United States to go to other countries. Canada has taken a few, Australia is taking a few. I know France has taken a few, and there are efforts But of course, compared to the number of people who really want to leave the country, particularly the scientists whose labs have been dismantled, there isn't enough positions, of course. So there's a sense of people would leave if they could leave. The reality is they really can't leave for a variety of reasons. But there is sort of this scoring sense of urgency to leave and get out. And so what we have, as we mentioned in other talks, the US higher education system, which has been so dominant for so many decades, is really incredibly destabilized by the current political landscape. And there are potentially massive shifts in global higher education. There is no doubt about it. Lots and lots of people, I assume, on Zoom and in the room today are thinking about mobilities of students and faculty and how this is going to impact different research agendas, different kinds of collaborative work together, and so on. So I don't really know how that's going to play out in the current couple of years. What I did want to pause here and sort of mention was John Douglas's sort of analysis or presentation a couple of weeks ago. This is the new academic war on higher education, and I'm not sure I actually agree with his analogy of it being a new academic Cold War, because I think from the position that I'm in, it's not necessarily cold at all. In fact, I think it's heating up very dramatically. I'm also not sure that we can call it a Cold War in the sense that it's unlike the Cold War, which was, the US was in competition with Soviet Union to increase its prominence on a world scale in terms of space and economics and science and so on. We're seeing the opposite in the US, the complete dismantling of higher education, right? It's not about beefing up higher education, which had already been so dominant in competition with other countries. It's really about one man's desire, backed up, of course, by a huge, the Heritage Foundation and a sort of deep MAGA group. But it's about the dismantling of knowledge itself. It's really not just about higher education and the attack on colleges and faculty and research and supposedly critical scholarship. It really is the attack across the board on science and expertise and knowledge that allows people to think critically. So I think the Cold War analogy is not entirely sitting well with me. I think of it much more as a particular person being a dictator and really seeking to dismantle knowledge production from the perspective of people sitting in the United States. So as we know, the Trump administration has attacked all climate science, dismantling records of atmospheric oceans and currents and so on, data that has been central not just to the United States, but to people around the world in charting and managing and reporting on climate change catastrophes and how they're impacting certain continents and regions. He's attacked, of course, labor and employment expertise by firing the statisticians in the Labor Department. He's attacked medical expertise by forcing the resignation of people who have pushed back about the value of vaccines. He's attacked economic expertise, trying to force Lisa Cook to resign from the federal economic agencies. So if there's a general attack, not just higher education, I think we always need to think of higher education as one front in a bigger battle here, at least in the United States, about attacking all kinds of knowledge and expertise that, as I say, provides the sort of space and critical conversation that could challenge Trump's executive demands and his authority to govern, in short. So here you have people pushing back. This is an AI-generated magazine cover of Life that was put out by the Trump administration. And you had thousands and thousands of people marching on the streets a couple of months ago. And you have many, many, many protests coming on board, federal workers being forced to resign and on the streets protesting. And of course, just recently, we've seen the response, right? So we have Trump sending in the National Guard into Los Angeles, where protests were against the ICE pickups of people based on the color of their skin. And we've had National Guard, of course, sent into Washington, D.C. Apparently, they're going to be there until Christmas time. And we've got the National Guard now being sent into Memphis. So any big urban center where people are protesting and coming together and questioning the Trump administration, the National Guard are going to be sent in. So this is a trend, a wave that's very, very, very distressing. Alongside the National Guard now being very aggressively mobilized, you've had over the last couple of years many states putting in anti-protest bills. This is not unique to the United States. It's happened in Britain. It's happened in Germany, Australia, Canada. Many countries have over the last couple of years put in anti-protest bills that have been driven at least initially by big oil and about protests around environmental activism. But the laws are still in place, and it gives an extraordinary amount of control to the police to break up any protests. So this is sort of the legal underpinnings of the National Guard, which are much more extreme, sort of public expression of police power on the streets. And you have things like the Trump administration, Trump here himself, visiting these new Alligator Alcatraz, this new prison system that's being established in Florida. There was appeals to halt the process of it. They're ongoing. But on the right-hand side of the slide, you will see detention centers for migrant people who are supposedly in the country illegally, but really there's just been huge sweeps of people who are US citizens who do have the paperwork but have been rounded up based on the color of their skin, which has been endorsed and okayed by the Supreme Court. So it is, it is an extraordinary position that the US is in. My department manager is a Latina woman. She comes to campus very, very fearful, as do 40% of our students who are first-generation students. So this is the national context, but it very much plays out in the campus culture. So I'm going to leave you there with a picture of the National Guard mobilizing in DC. The message is that we're all very, very unsafe in the US, and the attack on higher education is only one front of what truly is, without a doubt, an emerging fascist state in the US. And I think that, thinking about higher education, the future of higher education here has to come to terms with the political landscape of what the next couple of years may be. And after that, we're not sure whether Trump is going to change the Constitution, have a third term, but even if he actually is not president after his second term, what the damage he has done to the civil servants, the agencies, and the college and campuses will be astounding. It will take decades, I think, to replace. So it is a very bleak image that we are facing in the United States. So with that, I'll close up the slideshow, and I'd love to hear from the audience with questions, please.
Brilliant, thank you very much. That was really quite bleak, but we need to hear it, and it was really, really good. You were so frank and open with us. We've got questions from the online audience, so I'll go straight to them, and then I'll bring the room in and myself later. Rachel, do you want to start, please?
Thank you. Thanks. That was a really fascinating, if very depressing, presentation. I was just wondering if you could say something about kind of how students have responded to the situation, because I guess in the UK we hear less about them and the impact you think on their politicization. Thank you.
Sure. So, around the protests around Gaza, the students were quite mobilized, but it was still a relatively small group on campuses. Even my campus, it was, a sort of encampment of a couple of hundred students, perhaps. It was very peaceful. They all did their homework for a couple of weeks. They had tents and so on. It was not a disturbance in the way that I think some of the media has made out. And I think that was probably pretty typical of the encampments from what I could see. Then, of course, there was the crackdown on my campus and other campuses with the police and arrests. And for some of those students, they have now been suspended. One faculty member in my own department was arrested as well, and it has caused a great deal of concern. But students on the whole, you know, on the one hand, you could say the campus has opened up again, people are back, it's that usual excitement of being back at school, and, you know, people are wandering around saying, excuse me, can you help me? I don't know where my lecture hall is, and it's that usual sort of muddle and fuddle of the first week of classes and excitement. And I suppose for some, well, maybe the majority of students, you know, if you're in chemistry classes and if you're engineering and if you're in classes that are studying Shakespeare, perhaps it doesn't impact you. But certainly in the School of Social Sciences and Humanities, those people who are teaching politically charged topics around immigration or inequality or around law and justice and racism, we're all feeling it, and the students are feeling it. So I do think there is a sort of, it depends on the context of the classroom, and it depends upon the trajectory of study that the student is doing. But for a good third of the students, I think there is a great deal of anxiety and sort of feeling of the stress of what's going to happen. Then you also have ICE. And so ICE could come on our campus at any moment, right? And we've been told if they come on campus, there's nothing we can do. If we're in a classroom and teaching, we can close the door and we don't actually have to allow them in. But that's, I think, a little bit easier said than done. It's very intimidating if there were people knocking at your door. And for many faculty, particularly my department, they fear that the ICE is coming for them as well, not just the students in the classroom. So, so that is very distressing. And we have literally been told there is nothing that the university will do if they're on the campus.
Thank you.
And Rachel's comment about politicization, do you think it's changing student politics?
Yeah, I do. I think it is changing student politics amongst some students. Some students have become extremely politicized and extremely aware of what's going on. I think the majority have probably just put their head down and don't want to hear it in reality. So I also think there's a divide amongst the student body as well.
Gosh, okay. Thank you very much, Rachel and Eve. Claudia, you're next. You're asking for predictions of the future, which is, of course, what we're worried about as well. What's going to happen next? Do you want to ask your question to Eve, Claudia? Can you unmute yourself? Oh, you can't be back in. In which case, I'll read it out for you, Claudia. So the question is simply, what would be your prediction for next year in terms of what's happening, given this is only the first year of 4?
Well, if I could really tell you that, I might make a fortune, or maybe not. I don't think it's going to get better. I think it's going to get worse, unfortunately. I can't see how it's going to get better. I think the bombardment daily of attacks on universities and colleges with threats of defunding is not going to let off. I think, if anything, Trump is going to become more and more aggressive. He's taking on the UC system, which is, as we know, the biggest public university system in the country. So he hasn't made the progress or the symbolic progress that he'd hoped with Harvard, though Columbia did capitulate. So I think he's increasingly angry and wants to use the public school system now in a way. So it's not just the big private elites that are very, very symbolic in terms of higher education. So I think it's going to get worse. I think the impacts of the research defunding is going to really start to be felt in the next 6 to 12 months. I think some, research labs have been able to limp along. They've been able to, garner some certain funds from different parts of the campus and so on. But I think ultimately in 12 months, the science labs are really going to feel the pain. So, generally, I think it's going to be bad. In the classroom of my 100 students, I have one tutor, one TA to help me, and they're now threatening that with the potential budget cuts with the Trump administration, I will be teaching my 100 students on my own. So within the classroom, the teaching and pedagogical mission has been severely threatened. Because the classes are still not going to get smaller. They need the students to pay tuition, of course. So the quality of education is, I think, going to decline, though I think my university leaders, as many university leaders, say that AI is the answer, right? That apparently we're going to have AI grading papers that are written by AI. So amongst the faculty, there's a great deal of pushback against AI. Which is, not to say that it doesn't have some amazing applications in certain contexts, but within the classroom, I think it is limited, and it's certainly not the solution for real mentoring and pedagogical teaching in a way that makes meaningful sense to me. So, on lots of fronts, I don't think it's going to get better. I think it's going to get worse, unfortunately.
Certainly John was pointing to next year's allocations of funding as being much more powerful and much harder to dispute. He also wondered about the midterms having a mitigating effect.
Yeah, no, the midterms are going to be interesting. I think that the sense of people in the US is that there is, even those who voted Republican last election, the attack by ICE on and rounding up people, I think, has really created a new sort of disgruntlement amongst the Republican supporters. I think that that's potentially a very, very important issue. But we shall see, so I think the midterm could be a moment of pushback to the degree that the gerrymandering and the tinkering with the election process occurs. I'm not sure what to say about that. There's a deep, deep sense that the election process is going to be compromised. So I'm hoping that the midterms, there's a sort of a wave of pushback. And we'll see what happens with that. But as I say, I'm also not confident of the electoral process. So it will be a very tense time. And, even today, I'm not really sure what's going to happen with Hesketh, ordering all the military commanders to come and get a private hearing. That's unfolding before us today and tomorrow. So I think everyone's very fearful. What is going to be told to the military leaders? And it may be that they're arming up around the midterm. I don't know.
Just to finish on the ICE conversation, Maria, did you want to come up in that question you had about European campuses?
Yeah, sorry. So I was just wondering, because at least in the European systems that I'm aware of, the universities have certain autonomy, so the police forces cannot enter without actually having a permission of the university authorities. So I was wondering, what's the situation regarding this in the US? Is it different? Is it the same?
Very good question. So I think, in a general sense, campuses are different, right? So some campuses do have a much stronger sensibility of not allowing police onto their campus. That being said, I think almost all universities and colleges in the United States have some private, university police force. So I know that my campus has its own police force. And, I also was a little surprised, just coming from Australia, where, the campus was a sacred space. You never saw police on campus at least 30 years ago when I went there. Here you do see police on campus, and as we saw with the protests around Gaza last May, in May 2024, the Chancellor did have to invite the national, the riot police, 300 riot police. He did have to invite them onto campus. So there is a sense a little bit of university campus autonomy. But with ICE, it's actually slightly different. ICE have supposedly the power of the federal government to go wherever they want. So they're going into, agricultural fields down the Central Valley, and picking up people who are picking, up lettuce and vegetables out of the fields. They're going to, as we saw with the Korean company, they're going into big company grounds. They're going to campuses. They actually supposedly have the authority to go wherever they want. They can go into a government agency building. They can go into law courts, as we've seen. So there doesn't seem to be that sense at all of any physical autonomy of the campus when it comes to ICE. They do supposedly have the authority to go wherever they want. And when they march into a courtroom or the lobby of a bureaucratic agency, no one's going to get in their way. I mean, we've seen that they're pushing people over, they're grabbing people and putting them in paddy wagons. Even Democratic politicians, as you've seen on the news, have been pushed over and arrested, handcuffed. So even when the cameras are rolling, the media is following the actions. They still seem to be present. So I don't think that any university campus feels at all safe that they would not come onto the grounds.
Okay, thank you, Maria, for that question. And Jan, you've had your hand up for a while. You asked a question about the current data for internationalization. Do come in.
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I'm from the German Academic Exchange Service, and we are really closely watching the data and the numbers that we can get on international student numbers in the US, because for us it's really interesting to see if there's an effect, a kind of Trump effect on the international student numbers in the US. And up to like 1 or 2 weeks ago, all the data looked as if there would be a decline of about 15% or something like that. But now Chris Glass published this new analysis based on the current SEVIS data, which is for the data for September, I think, and now it looks as if there would be even a small increase by about 1% of the international students in the US, and this really surprised us and also Chris Glass, because everyone was expecting a decrease. So I'm wondering if you have your thoughts on this, or if you think it's an error in the data, or if you have any explanations for this finding.
So it's a great question, and I think we also thought that we would have a decline in international students. So I mean, that was a couple of months ago. Remember, a couple of months ago, one of the executive orders was very much about visas were going to be withheld. And over the summer, at least our summer, many international students did not go back to their homes, fearful that they would not be allowed back into the United States. So, I mean, it was a really huge concern. So it is interesting. So, we have actually 9 doctoral students joining my department this fall, and half of them are international students from all around the world. So I didn't expect to see them all either. So we do seem to have maintained the international student body. I don't know whether that's going to hold, because we now have the HB1 visa, which is requiring a university to pay for international faculty at least $100,000. So it's a moving target. It's a really moving target. I think that the tech companies probably had some influence here in Trump letting off a little bit on students coming from India and China. But I don't know enough about that sort of the daily play and how that works out. But international students are here in the US. They don't necessarily have the funding support that they had in the past. So how long they will stay here and how long this trend will hold, I'm not sure. But it's a fascinating conversation about student mobility, international students. What I anticipate, given that I don't think it's going to get happier times in the immediate future in the US, I anticipate that a lot of undergraduate students and maybe postgraduate students will be leaving the United States, American students. So I actually think there's going to be a movement out of the United States to places that are perceived to be relatively, conflict-free and welcoming. I think Canada, I think Australia, I think New Zealand for obvious reasons. I think Britain, because people speak English and Americans aren't particularly good at their language expertise. So I do think that there's going to be a drive for parents to send their students beyond the United States, particularly at the more junior levels. I don't know about master's and PhD students, but certainly if you were doing a PhD in astrophysics or STEM in some way, I don't think that the US context is going to hold much joy for you in the coming years. So I don't know what to say. It's a very good question. I can only imagine the data is correct. I don't know, obviously, and that's the problem. Now we're actually questioning where the data is coming from and who's providing it. But I assume the data is correct, at least for the moment, and it will be interesting. I don't know whether this trend's going to hold, though.
And I guess there might be also some sunk costs in people having decided quite a long time ago to apply, and therefore it's a big decision to not take that money you've been offered quite a long time ago, and you're playing a risk. And as Connor puts, perhaps you just have to hedge that risk and hope for the best. Who knows? I agree with you, David. I think people take, these are decisions that are made a year ago, and so there's still a lot for what draw people to do postgraduate work here. Absolutely, but I think that the joy of coming and the decisions to come are going to be questioned in the coming year or two. Well, thanks for highlighting that piece, Jan, because that's actually really interesting. Some good data there by Chris Glass. John, you've had your hand up for a bit. John Brennan, do you want to come in?
Yes, please.
Hi, John.
I think, very interesting, very frightening, but it also, makes me kind of go back to history a bit. And I find, in a sense, as one gets older, history gets bigger and gets more relevant. And just to share one experience that I never forget was visiting Barcelona in Spain some years ago now, to meeting up with an academic there who had worked with me at my own research centre in Britain. And I was there to, I think, speak at a conference somewhere, but she invited me to go and see her university, which was the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She picked me up from my hotel. We walked down the road for about 20 minutes, and then we got on a train. And the train was moving out, and quite soon we'd left Barcelona. And so I asked her, where are we going? I thought we were going to your university. Her reply was, yes, we are. We're not too far away, but we've left Barcelona. Oh, she said, you don't understand, do you? The Autonomous University of Barcelona was created during the years of the Spanish dictatorship. And there was a strong concept that universities can be dangerous institutions. If you build them out in the countryside, it's much safer because you can build high walls around them. You can send in the police and the troops, etc., etc. So if the university was actually going to exist, it needed to be out in the countryside. And I always remember that because, again, you know, in the literature about higher education, one can find plenty of examples of when universities were regarded as dangerous institutions. You know, so to some extent, you know, I mean, I'm appalled about what is happening in the US, you know, at the moment. But again, in the bigger historic context, maybe I'm not so surprised.
Thank you, John.
That's an amazing story, and it's a very good point that you're making, John. That we have seen, of course, many historical events before this in which universities were politically censored or controlled or policed in some way or another, whether it's in Franco Spain or in Italy or certainly in the United States. So my university was built in the 60s, and it was built precisely around a big central park, precisely so that students could not actually storm the main administration building, right? So it's actually laid out for troops and tanks, frankly, to come onto campus. The whole UCs were basically built in the 60s in a sort of moment of great expansive higher education in the United States, but they were very much intentionally built so that you could actually have police presence on campus very easily. And the University of California, Santa Barbara, the students burnt down the bank. So, you know, the whole thing is laid out. But so I take your point very much about there being other instances, certainly, of policing higher education. But I'm also have been, you know, and in my book, I lay out many of the former moments, the Red Scare, the McCarthyism, and so on in the US in particular. But I'm also been on many panels with the sort of leading historian, Ellen Schrecker, on McCarthyism and higher education in the US. She's written this trio of history books that are just amazing. And she is adamant that the current moment is 10 times worse than McCarthyism. So her argument, and I agree with her argument, is that under McCarthyism and under previous moments like the free speech movement at Berkeley and so on, where you had students on the streets and tear gas, and Kent State University in 1970, where you actually had 4 students who were actually shot by the National Guard. These are terrible, terrible moments, absolutely. But Ellen Schrecker would say they pale in comparison to the current moment, because the current moment is about ripping down the higher education sector entirely, right? Dismantling the Department of Education, dismantling all knowledge production, unless it sort of revolves around security issues and technology, certain technology. In other words, she said, you know, she says under McCarthyism, there were certain faculty and students were targeted because of their ideology or their ethnicity or the color of their skin. But this is actually like attacking, again, it's not the only university, but it's highly symbolic, Harvard, right? It's attacking the centers of knowledge production that are admired and leading around the world. And that is a completely different scenario from moments of other dictatorship and authoritarian governments where you allowed at least universities to be built. This is about literally dismantling them if they could be, right? So it's a sort of a different kind of political agenda here that I personally don't really understand entirely. I think that's one of the big problems for many people, just as I think some of the the people asking John Douglas a couple of weeks ago on his talk, why is Trump dismantling the economy with the tariffs? Why is he doing things that seem very perverse and the antithesis of what one would expect? And that's the problem. I just don't get it. Why would you take down higher education, US higher education? I don't know, except that he fears, as I've said, as do other authoritarian leaders, that universities, whether you're in Barcelona under Franco or whatever, are sites in which students and faculty can get together and ferment different kinds of conversations and political and critical inquiry. But I do fear that the current US moment is much, much worse than anything that we can point to. I mean, I can point to Hungary. So, Orbán dismantled the higher education sector in Hungary. And that was his agenda, and that's Trump's agenda, to dismantle it. The Hungarian higher education system is in shreds. And, Trump is an admirer of Orbán. So there are these commonalities between their agendas and so on that are really very incomprehensible, but also I think very fearful when we think about the US.
Yeah, and there's obviously a playbook that you can swap stories and learn from. You hinted at telling us a bit about how this is playing out in your own department, Global Institute Studies. Can you tell us a bit more about that in terms of choosing books for syllabuses? Actually the day-to-day organization of a course. Can you ask people not to bring their phones out in class? I mean, are there ways of sort of managing those fears on everyone's shoulders?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we huddled together in a faculty retreat last week, trying to think through together what are some of the strategies. Some people are saying, no use of phones in the classroom. That's not as easy to actually police. I mean, students have all sorts of ways to record you that you and I can't even imagine, frankly. But also, if you're in a class and lots of students, increasing numbers need help, student service support, and some of that student service support, disability support, requires them to be able to record your lecture and so on. So it seems like a sort of obvious first step, but it's actually very difficult. Certainly up to this point, each individual instructor is allowed to choose the books of their course. We design it as a curriculum that's sort of coherent together as a faculty. But when it comes down to the individual selection and control of the syllabus, that's up to the individual. Some faculty say, I'm not going to change a thing, and they can come for me. Some faculty say, I'm going to change the title of my course and hope that I'll just go under the radar. You've got some faculty, not at my campus, but at other campuses like Columbia, saying, I can't teach Middle East studies. I can't teach Middle East history because I'm going to be scapegoat. I'm going to lose my job. So I'm not teaching this class. So it does range across the board. And obviously it ranges in the more extreme case of just saying, I can't teach this class, depending on the subject matter of your class. So, but in my department, people are very, as I said, very concerned. And as a department chair, I cannot offer much comfort. So the dean has come to our department and has said, make sure you have your own lawyer at hand. So we've shared, resources. The AAUP and the Center for Defense of Academic Freedom has a whole list of websites and resources on legal people who are experts and can give counsel, know your rights in the classroom. We've been trying to sort of get the word out just in terms of actually lowering people's anxiety levels. But when your dean says, get your lawyer organized, that's where we're at. So at the same token, we had a chancellor send a message out yesterday saying we're a campus that recognizes and honors academic freedom and all topics will be respected. And I'm not sure what people really feel about that.
As in, it's easy to say, but harder to put into practice. Okay. Have you been surprised at how the UC system has caved?
I've been very disappointed with the University of California. Very disappointed. You probably all heard Judith Butler was on Democracy Now! And wrote about it, but last couple of weeks ago, UC Berkeley announced that it had given 160 names of students, faculty, and staff to the Trump administration. And the political theorist Judith, she said that she went on publicly, Judith Butler, and said that this is outrageous, and intonated, though it's not been proven, that all other UC campuses also gave names. And that was just that Berkeley had the decency to list the people named and let them know that they'd been named. But so we're all not sure what each campus has done. And no one's actually been very forthright in either denying that names were given at my campus or giving us the names. So it's all very ambiguous, but Berkeley did admit it. And I sort of feel that that's an absolute line that's been overstepped that will be very, very hard to roll back in terms of people's comfort level and trust of their institution. Because there's no due process. As Judith Butler says, there's no due process. Their names have been given, they're not even told why they've been given, and they don't know what's going to happen. So if I'm being listed, if I was one of those 160 names, I would be certainly thinking about my teaching and syllabus and what I'm going to say in the classroom. Because everyone, including the students, know that you've been listed. So you're sort of under a microscope at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a question in the room here. Gonzalo in Oxford. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. My question was actually about the possible complicity or collaboration within the institutions with these attacks. And for example, through a student like recording their lecturers and complaining to the university, or colleagues taking decisions against other colleagues standing, for example, against the genocide in Gaza. So how do you see, what are your views in that collaboration, and what do you think do make sense for them collaborating this? Is just fear, is opportunism, or there is a particular view on higher education that they are trying to promote?
It's a very, very good question. I don't have a very clear answer. There is certainly complicity in many corners, as it were. I think one of the aspects that may not be so widely known, at least it wasn't until Charlie Kirk's assassination, but Turning Point USA was one of a number of organizations where students were encouraged to go and record their teachers, and often got paid $100 for each recording. So it was a sort of system that's been in place for some years, where professors were on the professor watch list. And those students were literally just paid. So I don't know what their actual motivation, apart from getting money, was. Presumably there's some political motivation, but I really don't know. Students are students. So there is a sense of, I think there's a sense of distrust and complicity amongst the leadership of most universities and colleges, as certainly on my campus when the chancellor called in an emergency for the 300 police to come. That will never be forgiven or forgotten. I think across my campus and across many other campuses around Gaza and the protests, there was a great deal of people just putting their head down. And it really only affected the social science and humanities faculty and students in particular, really. I think now, under the second Trump administration's extreme ramp up against funding for research, for STEM, I think campuses have woken up a little bit more, right? So it impacts the whole campus, not just the so-called woke radical professors who are engaged in political conversation. Which is, if there's a good silver lining to millions of dollars being taken away from extremely important research, it is that it's impacting all campus, the entire campus community, as it were. At the same token, I've been extraordinarily surprised about the lack of mobilization amongst scientists, so-called STEM scientists. So, you know, again, when we have protests and faculty protests on my campus, it's a meager few people from the social science and humanities. The law school has been extraordinarily pathetic in its response, and I think that's also quite common across many law schools. Law schools should have done a lot more, and they've done very, very, very little. So up to, you know, up to the second Trump administration, it was the majority of the burden for defending the right to protest, for defending the right to politically call out what people wanted to call out around Gaza, was really on the shoulders, borne on the shoulders of a relatively small fraction of the faculty and student population. It, of course, is now a different scene, but I haven't seen the mobilization I would expect from across each campus in response to the devastating defunding of research. Because, you know, for many people who are relying upon labs and technicians and postdocs and so on, their research is gone. It's just gone. So I don't know really what, there's nothing to lose. I would have hoped that, you know, all the scientist population on faculties would have been marching more rapidly than anybody else, but I haven't seen that at all. So that's a sort of complicit, sort of my passive complacency. There's just silence. There are some very, very good scientists who are pushing back. There have been some legal actions, you know, brought, but they're a very small number, right, compared to who's impacted. So that's disappointing.
I mean, yeah, more than disappointing. It's 3 p.m. here, and we could talk about this. Or I mean, I've never been. I mean, you know, we have a range of webinars, but this has been a very, very depressing one. But it's a really important one for us all to hear quite what's happening at the classroom level, and our thoughts are with you all. But thank you very much for these. You know, what really is quite a shocking story. As Ian McNay says in the chat, perhaps these things will pass. Well, we can only hope. But having you know, your perspective both on the national and on this heating up, as you put it, of the attack on universities, it has been really, really important for this seminar series. So thank you very much, Eve, for getting up early. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, and we're going to continue this conversation of universities under fire with Brexit next week. And then we are also going to turn to South Africa and Israel and use of universities in their twin struggles. So please come back and join us in weeks to come. This recording will be available tomorrow or soon afterwards on our website and the slides again. Thank you, Eve, for those. And have a good day. Now you can get your morning coffee now. Thank you very much, Eve. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye.